a video request from DTC here, and it is a Father Peter Here's video on the screen. Okay, so let's watch. Let's see what, let me see here, make sure he's on 125, because he takes a long time to talk. A lot of people do. I watch almost everything on 125 these days, so. All right.
So let's look at this just real quick. So his problem is you've broken off Eucharistic communion, and yet you do not consider that you cause a schism, or that we stand outside the church. So for him, this is impossible. But in fact, if you look at Canon 15, you'll see that that's exactly what has been created through Canon 15. And let's do that. This was held in 861 under St. Photius in the Church of the Apostles, before the ecumenical council. This is Canon 15 of this so-called First Second Council, is what it was called later on. And it's a large gathering with the papal legates from the West, and they're ruling on they're issuing canons. There's actually 3 canons that are related here to the whole situation, because they had certain phenomena at the time, a lot of confusion, a lot of breaking of commemoration and communion of their bishops and patriarchs, and there was a lot of chaos. And they after the iconoclast 100 years of iconoclasm, of course, there was a lot of chaos, and so they have canons that are condemning those priests or bishops who, for non-dogmatic, questions that do not pertain to the faith, ceased commemoration of their bishops and broke off. They condemn those instances. Then they have Canon 15. It says the following, which is trying to say, well, yes, but we do have this case where breaking communion or ceasing commemoration is not condemnable. Actually, it's praiseworthy. When is that? That's really important. And why? Why is that something that's praiseworthy? And then if you understand the thinking of the fathers here, you can understand why Metropolitan Cyril's stance, which essentially is the basis for the church going underground, not continuing under Sergius. And we got to understand why. On what basis can he have that stance? Because that's the stance that then justifies so much more going forward. And so we have to go into the mind of the fathers here in the canon and try to understand why Sergius is wrong. You know, Sergius is saying here there's things that are incompatible according to his mind. You don't call it schismatics. You don't say we're without grace. You see how you think very legalistically, just externally. And so there's no grounds for your schism, and yet you have no communion with us, and you don't consider us outside the church. So how does that work? Well, let's look at Canon 15 and see how it works. Now, I'm going to read the whole thing quickly because we have a lot to cover, so stay with me. The rules laid down with reference to presbyters and bishops and metropolitans are still more applicable to patriarchs. So that in case any presbyter or bishop or metropolitan dares to succeed or apostatize from the communion of his own patriarch, it's very important. There are brothers here who are justifying their stance against the entire Orthodox Church, saying that we need to break communion with everybody and anyone across the board, all around the world, whether they're my bishop or not. But this canon doesn't talk about anybody but his own bishop, his own patriarch. And fails to mention the latter's name in accordance with custom duly fixed and ordained in the divine mystagogy, but before a conciliar verdict has been pronounced and has passed judgment against him, creates a schism. All right, so let me say that again. In case any presbyter, bishop, metropolitan succeeds or apostatizes from his own patriarch and does not commemorate him, and before a conciliar verdict, before a council has happened, he pronounces judgment against him, he creates a schism. Right, so this is what Canon 15. This is a canon that many who have ceased commemoration and gone and break communion and set up parallel jurisdictions, such as the old Calendars groups, this is the canon they cite. In fact, the first part of the canon condemns one who, before a council, does this. And we'll look at the second part, which needs some explanation.
Well, yeah, hold on a second. Okay, the first case, what he's saying here is, well, this is what we use to justify our existence. Canon 15. No, Canon 15 exists so that those who break communion from a heretical bishop have the right to go under a right-believing bishop. This is the part he leaves out. It's not like the idea is that you're trying to restore canonical order, not destroy it. And so this is kind of for lack of a better word, kind of a dishonest way of presenting it. The simple reality is that no, you do have the absolute right, if your bishop is pronouncing some sort of heresy, to leave. That's a given. It's what you do afterwards. You can't start your own church. You just have to go under a canonical bishop and work with what he says. And when I say a canonical bishop, I mean one that's following the holy canons, not one that calls himself canonical because he's part of a team of heretics that puts themselves together as some sort of grouping. And further, I'm going to tie this a little bit further that let me note this because this is kind of important. Let me see here. If you give me just a second. I just want to switch the screen for just a moment. And so people often assume that Canon 15 of the First Second Synod works on its own. It doesn't. It doesn't actually work on its own. I'm going to show you real quick from the rudder, if I may. Give me a moment. This, okay, where is it? Let me see if it's going to pop up here. Okay, I don't know why I didn't do that. Share. Okay. This is the text of the first canon of the Third Ecumenical Council. And so I'm going to just increase the size here to make it nice and big so people can read it on the screen. But if you look, Canon 15 of the First Second Synod is actually based on the Third Ecumenical Council, which anathematized Nestorius. Now, there's a reason that I'm bringing this up, because one of the things certain apologists like to bring up is, well, what about the case of Nestorius? They didn't break communion immediately with Nestorius. Fun fact, not only did they break communion with Nestorius, but the canonical response from the Third Ecumenical Council is the very basis of Canon 15. And so I'm going to read Canon 1 and then the interpretation. It says, since for those who any reason, whether of an ecclesiastical or physical nature, are absent from the Holy Synod and remained in their own town or district, ought not to be left in ignorance of the Synod's regulations regarding them, we make known to your holiness and love that if any metropolitan of the province has apostatized from the Holy Ecumenical Synod and joined the assembly of the apostasy, or has joined it thereafter, or has adopted the sentiments of Celestius or intends to adopt them, he shall have no power whatsoever to perpetrate anything against the bishops of the province, being already expelled and stripped of every function in all ecclesiastical communion by the present synod. Moreover, he shall be liable in any case to be expelled from the rank of the episcopate by those very bishops of the province and by surrounding metropolitans who adhere to the beliefs of orthodoxy. And then the interpretation notes, if we go a little further, because the beginning talks about Ebus of Edessa, basically it says that anyone who entertained the heretical views, they have no power to do any ill turn to the bishops or even to the laymen that are Orthodox. That is to say, because they've been deprived of every ecclesiastical communion and function by this synod. And he's to be rendered utterly destitute and henceforth the rank of episcopate, even by those same Orthodox bishops and surrounding metropolitans. Likewise, Canon 2 talks about those who basically skipped out on the synod and refused to show up. Canon 3 says, if any clergyman in the city or district have been shorn of holy orders by Nestorius and his party on account of their believing rightly, we've adjusted it right and just that they be restored to their own rank. We collectively bid the clergymen who agree in their beliefs with the Orthodox and Ecumenical Synod not to submit in any way whatsoever to the bishops who have apostatized or deserted us. In other words, this is literally blessing the motivation in Canon 15. Okay, I see that Sava's here. Welcome. And so basically, to get back to the video, the whole point is that this is not a novel interpretation of Canon 15. Canon 15 is, in fact, using previous canonical precedent to establish what the right thing to do in the face of the apostasy is. And ironically, the main example you can find in the councils is the Third Ecumenical Council involving Nestorius, which is why it's a little bit on the devious side to kind of use Nestorius, the history of Nestorius and the Third Council against Canon 15. They work together in tandem.
I have a comment, Father. Oh.
Sure.
With Father Peter, I mean, you were just talking about the Third Equal Council. One of the Holy Fathers that was present at the Third Equal Council was Saint Hypatius. And also, I need to silence the television in the background, or I just need to walk further away from it. Just walking here. Saint Hypatius was one of the Holy Fathers who was at the Third Equal Council, and he broke communion with Nestorius as soon as he learned what Nestorius was preaching.
Yeah,
He said, as soon as I heard he was speaking blasphemies about our Lord, I no longer consider him a bishop. Saint Cyril of Alexandria, in his letters, praised people who broke communion with Nestorius before he did, including Saint Hypatius.
That's correct.
The entire opening first act of the Seventh Equal Council already considered the iconoclasts to be outside the church. It didn't say, okay, now the iconoclasts are outside the church. They were already outside the church. They already said in the first... They didn't even produce an anathema against iconoclasm, did they?
If you look at the Acts of the Seventh Council, a lot of it is about restoring order between different parties of anti-iconoclast Orthodox. So none of this is new in history. And so let me see here. It's going to read these. We have to avoid from spiritual infections to avoid catching them. Peter Harris, please note. Reader John, he sure is. Yeah, he does move like a magician. I used to, and I've been honest about this, I used to really think that he was being like a straight shooter with this, and he legitimately believed this, and there was just a misunderstanding. And the more I learned, the more I realized that that wasn't the case at all. But pretty sad.
But this is the basis. This is the basic. We're going. First of all, we're stating the basis, and then we're saying the exception. Right? So the basis is before a conciliar verdict, you pass judgment, you break, you cease. You're creating a schism. The Holy Synod has decreed that this person shall be held an alien to every priestly function. In other words, he'll be suspended. If only he be convicted of having committed this transgression of the law. Accordingly, these rules have been sealed and ordained as respecting persons who, under the pretext of charges against their own president, stand aloof and create a schism and disrupt the union of the church. So they don't say what charges, just charges against their president. But the canon says, as for those persons, on the other hand, who on account of some heresy condemned by the holy synods or fathers, withdrawing themselves from communion with their president, who that is to say is preaching heresy publicly and teaching it bareheaded in church, such persons not only are not subject to any canonical penalty on account of their having walled themselves off from any and all communion with the one called a bishop before any conciliar or synodical verdict has been rendered. On the contrary, they shall be deemed worthy to enjoy the honor which befits them among Orthodox Christians. So what's the exception?
Heresy.
That because of a heresy already condemned by synods and fathers,
okay,
withdrawing themselves from communion with their president, who that is to say is preaching the heresy publicly and teaching it bareheaded in church. So he's totally unapologetic and intransient in his heresy. It's not somebody who's confused. It's not somebody who's just saying it privately. Publicly, he's doing it, and he's pushing it on the people. That's got to be happening. Of his own bishop, again, a heresy that's already been condemned by holy fathers or synods. And this person will be praised. He's due to honor among Orthodox Christians, even before any conciliar or synodical verdict has been rendered. So that's the exception. It has to be a declared heresy condemned by the synods of the fathers. But they have not defied, it says, they have defied not.
Yep.
How is ecumenism not considered that? How is ecumenism the odd one out?
This is where another sleight of hand happens, because ecumenism, as we know it, it's kind of, it's syncretic. The belief that, other religions, heresies, etc., are of equal or just slightly lesser weight than the church. The problem is that we see the reason we call ecumenism a pan-heresy is because we know that going into the synagogue and praying with the Jews is heretical. We know that going to a conventicle of heretics joins us with the heretics. We know that the papacy has been condemned. We know that the heresies in the Synodicon have been condemned. But ecumenism allows you to partake with all of these bodies. So here's what he's actually saying is not simply that all of these things aren't wrong. He's not even addressing that. But putting them all together, because it's something new, which it isn't really, is it hasn't been condemned. Well, no, all the other things have been condemned. Mashing them together doesn't mean they're uncondemned. It just means you're under multiple condemnations. Anyway.
Yeah, I would say to that, that's like if someone started saying, "Oh, well, I think Christ is a created being," but he doesn't use the term homoousios or homoousia. So do we need to condemn him again, like because he's using a different term?
That's exactly. Or like, if somebody starts saying that, like the transmigration of souls is true and Origen was unjustly persecuted. I mean, I don't know anyone like that, but the point is, yeah. So let's see how he finishes this. He's got a while to go. So
not bishops, but pseudo bishops and pseudo teachers, and they have not sundered the union of the church with any schism, but on the contrary, have been seducous to rescue the church from schism and division. But two things need to be stated again and really stressed.
All right, go ahead.
It's clear here that the aim is not that we simply cease commemoration, cease communion, and move on. That the whole point of this canon is that they lead to a conciliar verdict. That's clearly what is important here. Conciliar verdicts are the basis for the stance. There's been a conciliar verdict in the past condemning a heresy. And it's obviously that's where it's going to lead, right? So it happens before, but it's commemorated here before any conciliar synodical verdict. So there will be a conciliar synodical verdict. That has to happen. That's how the church works. We're conciliar.
The problem is that there have been conciliar verdicts, but more importantly, even if that wasn't the case, not every heretical schism has led to a conciliar verdict. The most obvious being that of the Roman Catholics. The fact that there was no official conciliar verdict until 1484, almost 500 years later, does not mean that there was no condemnation, that the Roman Catholics were uncondemned Orthodox, which is kind of what he's implying here. But in any case, we'll let him continue.
And so it's going to lead there. That's the point of the stance being praised, that it will lead to this, and therefore there will be peace in the church because there will be a decision that cannot be gainsaid if it's, of course, following the Orthodox faith, on the basis of the Orthodox faith. So those who, again, cease commemoration and communion with their own bishop, who's teaching heresy publicly and pushing it, that's already been condemned, and that person is doing it for the sake of the unity of the church, which means it's going to lead to a conciliar decision. That's the aim. It's not an end in itself. It's not just, obviously that would be total Protestantism, right? If we just said everybody can break communion left and right, and it doesn't matter if there's ever a council. No.
Straw man. That's a straw man argument.
It's a straw man argument. But you know what the worst part is? It's a papist straw man argument. And what I mean by that is that it is, one of the things that I've pointed this out is that a lot of World Orthodox kind of quote-unquote apologetic is actually just thinly veiled Roman Catholic apologetic, which is why I find it despicable.
Although ecclesiology, it's just papist. I've noticed this over the years because I came from papism.
It's an obsession. Well, think about it. The obsession with scholasticism. Where'd scholasticism come from? Roman Catholicism. Ignoring the fathers. All of that came from Roman Catholicism. So this doesn't actually surprise me. What he's basically doing here is saying, so if there's no official council from the official body, then, you just insert Vatican here and Vatican here, then it's all going to fall apart. Look at the Protestants. That's exactly what he's doing, which is why it was very relevant for Brian to say, as a Lutheran or Roman Catholic, Father Peter's positions mean we in the West should stand to the Pope and bishops as Orthodox are like true and genuine Orthodox. Yeah, and so there has to be a council that does the condemning. All right, let's see how awful it goes. And yeah, DTC, sorry, I didn't realize you didn't see the whole thing. I thought you did, but don't worry, there's only 8.5 more minutes to go.
No, we want a council. New martyrs are constantly calling for a council. That's how the things are solved. And
the new martyrs were actually calling for people to flee the patriarch first, but to flee the Surgeoness first. So no, that's not true.
So that's two words on the canon. Now going back to Bishop Sergius, why is his analysis incorrect? Why can't he figure it out? So he doesn't have in mind this canon, or if he has it in mind, he's not interpreting it correctly. He would say, well, this is what I'm doing. he's clearly not recognizing as a heresy or as a delusion, a teaching that's been condemned by the fathers. And on one level, he's right, because every time there's a new incarnation of a delusional stance, it's new. So it needs a conciliar decision. This will need a conciliar decision as well, as we said. But the stance of saying we're going to separate from you, not condemn you, because we're not the council to condemn you and say you are a heretic, but we're going to separate from you to protect.
Did he call St. Cyril of Kazan's position delusional? Just wondering about that.
I think you're saying heresy is delusional. I don't know.
All right, well, we'll keep going and see, but that's what it sounded like to me.
The church from your delusion, and this is in fact, in those days, this was the only real weapon they had. They couldn't do much more because of the communists. So they were breaking off communion precisely to do whatever they can to bring an end to the innovation and the delusion, the usurpation of power, and the distortion of the ecclesiology of the church. And yet they're not passing judgment. They're not saying that you're outside the church. They're not saying that there is created a schism. They're saying this needs to come to a council and needs to be solved. I think it's totally in the spirit of the canon. That's the narrow path.
So what he's saying is that what really should have happened is, under the Soviet period, the true bishops should have just met with the Sergianist bishops in council, where they probably would have been arrested and gulagged. That's what it sounds like to me. But anyway, we'll see.
That the canon sets out.
Huh?
It's not.
He might also be falling into that same trap that a lot of people, because St. Cyril of Kazan, in one of his epistles, one of his early epistles, he wrote, well, I don't know if Sergius is a schismatic or not. And people read that epistle from like 1936 and like, oh, well, look at that. The Catacomb Church didn't condemn the Sergianists. They thought the Sergianists were part of the church. But by 1941, he's like, no, Sergius is schismatic. The Moscow Patriarchate, or the Red Church, didn't have grace. They were clear later on. So you can.
The very example of St. Cyril that he picks is incomplete, simply because of the fact that he doesn't take into account. He doesn't take into account what.
So he's not he doesn't have in mind this canon, or
so this implication is absolutely ridiculous. But
he has it in mind. He's not interpreting it properly. He would say, well, this is what I'm doing. He's clearly not recognizing as a heresy or as a delusion. It's a conciliar decision. This will need a conciliar decision as well, as we said. But the stance of saying we're going to separate from you, not condemn you, because we're not the council to condemn you and say you are a heretic, but we're going to separate from you to protect the church from your delusion, and this is in fact, in those days, this was the only real weapon they had. They couldn't do much more because of the communists. So they were breaking off communion precisely to do whatever they can to bring an end to the innovation and the delusion, the usurpation of power, and the distortion of the ecclesiology of the church. And yet they're not passing judgment. They're not saying that you're outside the church. They're not saying that there is created a schism. They're saying this needs to come to a council and needs to be solved. I think it's totally in the spirit of the canon. That's the narrow path that the canon sets out. It's not an end in itself. Metropolitan Cyril is in the right and is following the spirit of the canon, because he's aiming toward a conciliar decision. He's aiming toward a solution in council ultimately, and he's not pronouncing a judgment as if he's the council and the infallible voice of the church. And this is the balance one has to keep if one is going to walk that path, which is a very difficult path. Notice it doesn't say must cease the president, commune with the president. As for those, he says, who withdraw themselves from such a heretical teacher.
There's that evil argument that I was talking about. The people who say there's an imperative implied in this canon, there's an imperative implied in the Third Ecumenical Synod, there's an imperative implied in the tradition of the church. When you start saying it doesn't say must, you're basically telling people to tolerate heresy. Which is the exact opposite of what the thrust of the canon is. That's evil. I mean, that's just like demonic. And no offense, and if Father Peter sees this, that's kind of demonic to like strain for gnats against the spirit of the thing, which is telling people how to avoid heresy so that they can stay in heresy. And I mean, I know he has, like, the book business to run, so on and so forth, but I really do appeal to his conscience. That's how people get led to hell.
I noticed as well.
Go ahead.
You're saying like, oh well, the Catacomb Church, they broke communion with the Surgeonists, and that's not right, but that's all they could do. And that's a very convenient, for lack of better terms to be found, mental gymnastics. It's like, oh well, they're being persecuted by the communists. Well, guess what? We're still being persecuted. I'm in the Russian Orthodox Autonomous Church. We're still being persecuted by the Russian government to this day.
Right. The water under the bridge argument doesn't work when they're actively trying to destroy you.
So if it's even by his own logic, if you're allowed to break communion before a consular basis, now ecumenism has been condemned by the church since the beginning. The apostolic canons say you can't pray with heretics. There was one of the seven minor synods, was the Council of Gangra, which condemned Manichaeism, and Manichaeans believed that Buddhists and Zoroastrians and whatnot could be saved. That was specifically condemned, and that was signed by the Holy Fathers. It's the Council of Gangra. It's one of the seven important local synods.
Right. Yeah, the one it was adopted in Trullo. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So with this idea, even by his own logic, even by how he's speaking here, unless you want to say that the persecution against the true Orthodox is not happening, which is objectively wrong, it is happening. Even the United States government recognizes that ROAC and the RTOC, Rokana, and other true Orthodox in Russia are actively being persecuted by the Russian government. You can go just look up articles on podocredo.ru from like an archive, or even like Internet Support, even like Agafanjo's people, are being persecuted. So
yeah, well, I think the main thing is that they, first off, this takes advantage of popular ignorance. Ultimately, they're banking on people not knowing. Father Peter knows. And for that adds a level of culpability that we have to keep in mind. And I really feel sorry for the men.
Worthy of honor, it says. It doesn't say they must do it anywhere in this canon. It doesn't say if they don't, there's going to be punishment. In most canons, if you don't do something, there's a punishment at the end. It simply praises them and protects them from synodical condemnation. It says this person shall not be condemned, it should be honored. And of course, the solution to that now rift between the cleric or the bishop or the patriarch is going to have to come through a council. So that's the spirit of the church in the canons. That's why St. Cyril's in the right, and he's not in the right.
If he holds that St. Cyril's in the right, he should hold it consistently, because St. Cyril decided eventually that Sergius was schismatic. But he's not going to do that, of course.
Well, Sergius, because his stance is papal-like. His stance is, I will decide, and you are. Instead of saying we have a rift now between us, let's come together as a church in council and solve this. None of that. There's none of that from Metropolitan Sergius. And if people are doing it today in the same way, if there are local churches or groups of Orthodox who are doing the same thing, saying you are a heretic, you are deluded, you are condemned, and they just get up and walk away, even if it's a local church, because a local church should not be satisfied. If it's a question of the faith, should not be satisfied with its own decision, but should bring it to the larger church, and there should ultimately be an ecumenical council. So there should never be this complacency. We have condemned, we have ruled, we have defrocked. It's over. That's not a responsible position. It's a papal-like decision, especially coming from only one bishop, of course, and a tiny portion of the hierarchy of the church in Russia. So hopefully I've explained why he misses it. He might be correct legally, but he misses the whole spirit of the canon. I think that's why.
I hate the fact that he says he might be correct legally, because that implies that the anti-canonical actions that Sergius did were correct legally. And no, they were not correct legally. Based on historical facts, based on the persecution of the catacomnics, they were not legally correct. But the fact that he says that they were legally correct means that even at some base level, he's justifying the persecution of the catacomb church. The catacomb church he's supposedly teaching people about.
Well, think about what the saints of Holy Rose say, especially a lot of the catacomb confessors and whatnot. Like, I think it was Saint Agatha, who was a fool for Christ. the Sergius came to her all the time. They said, "Oh, why don't you go with Sergius? He hasn't done anything uncanonical. He hasn't preached anything heretical." And Saint Agatha said, "No, he is worse than a heretic, because the church is a fake church. It's a parasynagogue."
Yeah.
Which I think Saint Basil even said that a parasynagogue is worse than schismatic or heretic. It's a parasynagogue.
Well, yeah, a parasynagogue lacks any sort of concept of authority at all. It's basically considered like an ecclesiastical anarchist group.
Well, in this case, the authority of the Moscow Patriarchate was the anti-Christian Soviet government.
Yeah.
So, it was not a legal entity. I mean, they did break all sorts of canons, but Saint Agatha explains it was worse than heresy, what Sergius did. Worse than heresy.
Okay. Don't forget, everyone, you can call in live with your questions or comments with the link at the top of the screen. Brian the Swede says, "A council, my heretical bishop I'm supposed to stay under tells me he is heretical. I wonder if you would disagree with St. Maximus the Confessor when he corrects the heretics for thinking local synodal councils are fully binding to the church, granted their Orthodox proclamations. Probably. Cowardly. Unbelievable. By his logic, he just condemned the Russian church abroad. Yep. Rokor said hundreds of times that the Russian church was the catacomb church, not the MP. Father Peter is just being nuanced and charitable." All right, so let's finish this one up.
I think going forward, you're going to see why St. Cyril is in the spirit of this canon. Now, some people get hung up, and this is a point of debate, about, well, it has something like ecumenism already been condemned in council? Not as such, not as this particular incarnation of this delusion. It's never been condemned in council.
Not in this particular incarnation of this delusion. What Father Peter is asking for is kind of the impossible standard. He wants to make sure that this is going to be a pan-Orthodox condemnation of modern ecumenism, even though all of the things that constitute ecumenism have already been condemned in many cases for centuries.
Well, I guess we need also a ecumenical council to condemn Jehovah's Witnesses, because it's a different version of Arianism.
Exactly. And we definitely need to create a new council to condemn Mormonism. And then we have to have a council to condemn all the stuff in the new councils for you see what kind of legal stupidity this gets into?
In this case, he wants a ecumenical council to condemn ecumenism that will be held by ecumenist bishops.
Right.
So
well, that's the grand joke of it, because 2016, he calls a robber council, but he recognizes all the bishops running the robber council.
Yeah, I mean, like the ecumenists, it's like, okay, this is going to run in. It's already happened. Some real, we've investigated ourselves and found that we did nothing wrong situation.
Yeah, exactly.
Do you think Bartholomew and all these other ecumenists are going to get to this council and be like, well, I guess we're heretics, we're going to depose ourselves now? Because Father Peter's situation, he doesn't think the true Orthodox are actually Orthodox bishops, so there's not going to even be Orthodox bishops who will actually be preaching Orthodoxy at such a council.
Yeah, Death to Compromise asks, what's the video timestamp? 1341. If you're wondering, 13 minutes, 41 seconds. Mental gymnastics, Lord have mercy. Hello, Reader John, God bless you. And let me see. Oh, gee whiz, nuance is the word that's used by people who are so full of facts they blind themselves from the truth. It's actually it's a Michael Lofton joke, because he was for a while making constant, demands that everyone has to be more nuanced and charitable. This is Mrs. Incredible Level Mental Gymnastics. I can't comment because I'll be honest, I actually don't think I've actually seen the full Incredibles movie yet. But anyway.
That is the distortion of the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church, the distortion of our understanding of the body of Christ, the blasphemy of claiming there's two churches there, or there's a church that's filled with heresy, or there's a partial church. All these kind of theories that we have. Two lungs, the same body theories, all these heretical theories that are we're trying to pass off as Orthodox. These things are new. Does that mean that we don't know if they're heresy or not? Of course we know they're heresy. The church always knew, even before Arius ever preached, they knew that Arius' position was a heretical
He just
position.
contradicted himself.
He needed to come in.
Yep, he did, because now he's saying that these things have already been condemned. But he's trying. This is the amount of.
But you can't condemn it till there's an imperial council.
Yeah,
This is pathetic.
It is. It's kind of sad.
Council and condemn it, though. And they actually happened many times, not just once. So if we had the idea that, well, it's already been condemned, we don't need to go to a council, we don't need a council to decide, you would not have the war and the battle and council after local council and second ecumenical council again coming back and essentially condemning the same heretical stances. And that's why the church didn't see the council in a legalistic manner, but as a need for particular people in particular time and place to affirm the faith and draw the boundaries for the sake of the faithful. That's what the decisions of the councils are, boundaries. We need a council and the boundaries and discernment of those boundaries from to put an end to the particular revealing or particular version of this delusion. There may have been other versions of this in church history. I don't remember anything so clearly against the ecclesiology of the church in church history as today. There, of course, have been many challenges to the ecclesiology. We can go back and we can see in the 17th century and things like that. But in this particular, so the question of it being a condemned by holy saints and fathers, well, yes and no. It was condemned essentially, but not particularly in time and place. And we need.
This is such legal gobbledygook. It's
so, Father. When have you heard essence versus particularity being used? What sect uses that kind of language?
Roman Catholics.
Okay, I just want to make sure there.
Well, with the thing about heresies, I guess by Father Peter's suggestion, because now he's placed everything on the emphasis of ecumenical councils or pan-Orthodox councils. I still don't know how the anathema against ecumenism doesn't apply by Father Peter's standard to everyone, because the people who wrote it literally said it did. St. Philaret said it did. Father Harampos, who wrote it, said it did. But I guess heresies that only existed locally, that were never condemned on any major level, like Jovianism. That's the example I always love pointing to, Jovianism. I guess it's okay to be a Jovian, according to Father Peter here. Is if some guy started...
it's
But he also condemned the Russian Church abroad.
Yeah.
So there you go. So you wouldn't recognize that council anyway.
It's ridiculous, but let's let him have his last minute and a half.
Okay.
Back and do that. It's essential. We're going to fight the delusion. So the same thing with, on the one hand, the person who today seeks commemoration for ecumenism or Sergianism is right in opposing the heresy, but it's not been yet condemned. So it's both and. We need to have people stand up and say, no, this is delusional if their bishop is preaching it, and yet that should not be an end in itself, as if it's already been decided by other fathers and figures in the past, because it's a new version, a new manifestation, which is unprecedented. And it needs to be condemned in particular in our day and age. So anyway, we can't get too much deeper. It's a very deep subject, the question of Canon 15. But I think that what we need to walk away with is that the spirit and the goal of St. Cyril, which was a conciliar solution, which was not a schismatic approach, not a legalistic approach, is what Metropolitan Sergius doesn't get and misses. And he remains baffled by St. Cyril's position because he's looking at things in a legalistic, superficial manner.
Okay, well.
That was a lot of verbal diarrhea.
Yeah, it was terrible.
That video was just as bad as I remember it being. I've actually seen that video before, and it's just as terrible as I remember.
I completely understand. Father Boniface, is Father Peter separating himself from those who separate themselves? Yeah.
Well, no, I think he's attached to that monastery.
Yeah,